Hi everyone, and a few more people popping in, but I'll keep going and we'll get started so that we have plenty of time for the main presentation. So, hi everyone, welcome to this special edition of our Landscape Ecology UK webinars, Landscape Connections. I'm Leanne Sargent and I work for Forestry England, and I'm part of the Landscape Ecology UK committee. For those of you who are new to Landscape Ecology UK, we are the UK chapter of the International Association for Landscape Ecology. We're part of a global community of researchers, policymakers and practitioners whose work and interests lie in the social and ecological dynamics of landscape. We are one of the longest running chapters of the Institute for Association for Landscape Ecology, having run for almost 30 years. And just wanted to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded onto YouTube, but we won't include the Q&A session in this recording. So today I'm delighted to welcome Johanna to talk about landscape scale nature recovery and the lessons that Forestry England have learned. Johanna will talk to us for about 20 minutes and then you'll have a chance to ask any questions. Feel free to use the chat function and write any questions throughout the event, and then we can read these out or we can unmute you so that you can ask the question yourself. We will aim to wrap up the webinar by 1:15. Okay, over to you, Johanna.
Lovely, thank you very much. And it's lovely to be part of a special edition. So I didn't realise that. So thank you very much for inviting me. I am the external funding lead at Forestry England. I'm mainly responsible for securing our grant-based income to support the organisation's priorities. Much of my current work is focused on green finance and exploring new ways that we can blend public and private funding to support our long-term environmental outcomes. So Landscape Recovery Scheme, which I'll be talking about in some detail, this is very much the business and funding model that sits behind that. So it is an area of interest and focus for us. I'm going to talk very briefly about how Forestry England is driving landscape scale nature recovery through landscape recovery scheme projects, but also just our other programs and how this aligns with them. I'm going to try and highlight the very practical lessons that we've learned as a result, but which fundamentally sit behind how we approach designing and delivering large scale restoration across some quite complex landscapes, with a particular focus on multi-partner approaches. So I will just move through these slides. So before I go into detail about the lessons learned from landscape recovery in particular, I'll just provide some context and a quick summary of the programs which we're delivering that involve landscape scale nature recovery. And again, as I said, that align with our wider landscape recovery work. So in 2022, we released our plan for biodiversity and how we're going to deliver a real step change in wildlife and nature recovery. There were 5 areas of focus, so protecting wildlife, creating networks of open and dynamic habitats, ancient woodlands and trees of special interests, but it also involved a number of forest wilding and species reintroduction projects, the majority of which are large-scale partnership projects, so particularly of interest to the focus of this webinar. So this is a snapshot of those project areas. So initially looking at kind of our forest wilding, so our wild core areas and our species reintroductions. And you can see how they're kind of spread across England, different areas of focus. And I will have a similar map for landscape recovery, so you can see how they do align. But just starting by looking at those wild core areas. So with more land and more trees than I think any other organisation in England, we do have the very rare ability to deliver landscape scale nature recovery projects over the long term. And these are just a snapshot of our phase 1 projects. And we've got there Kilda, which I think is the image on the left. Leanne will correct me if I'm wrong, which is by far the largest of these projects. So it includes extensive blanket bog, moorland, grassland of varying quality, and a significant hectareage of Sicta spruce. Then we've got Naroche, which I think is top right. So that's focusing very much on woodland, wood pasture and grassland. We've got Newtondale, which I think is the image in the middle, which is mostly valley woodland, including conifer plantation and some fen and grassland. And then we've got Wild Purbeck bottom right, which is all kind of focused on heath, grassland restoration, conifer plantations. So these are kind of our very large scale projects where we're working in partnership to deliver some of these ambitions. And they all are very ambitious. Which is where the partnership working comes in, because it really helps us scale up and achieve that. So those are our wild core areas. We also have our species reintroduction programs. So we're focusing on 5 priority keystone species. We've got beaver, wildcat, pine marten, white-tailed eagles and golden eagle in there. And there is a variety of activity happening across all of those different project areas, from wild releases for beaver. We've got enclosed populations of beaver. We're looking at feasibility studies. We're doing some national mapping of habitat suitability. Same for wildcat. We've got feasibility studies. We're doing a national disease risk analysis. Pine marten is similar. We've got some population monitoring projects. Again, numerous feasibility studies, 2 releases and the same disease risk analysis. White-tailed eagles, we have a wild release. We've got a feasibility sub-project, and with golden eagle, we're looking at a national recovery feasibility strategy to support natural recolonisation. So there's a lot going on species, and you will have noticed from that original map that they are quite well spread out across England. So these species reintroduction projects are either integrated into our wild core areas, or we are looking at delivering them on a wider landscape scale. They are all partnership projects, which is very much going to be a focus of when I go into detail about some of the challenges, some of the successes, and some of the lessons learned. And it all stems from that very complex landscape, very complex set of activity, and then a sort of stakeholder approach to that. So that's our forest wilding and our kind of so our wild core areas and species reintroductions. And then we are also involved in landscape recovery scheme projects. Landscape recovery, for those of you who are not familiar, it is one of DEFRA's 3 environmental land management schemes. It's considered the top tier because of its potential for long-term, large-scale funding and the bespoke nature of the scheme. So it can very much be a project that is funded, so it's not prescriptive. It can be, the funding can respond to what is needed for the actual project. So it really does give you free rein in terms of being ambitious, being inspirational, working at landscape scale and with multiple partners. The scheme projects, they kind of consist of a 2-year development phase, and that is followed by a 20+ year implementation phase. So it is a significant opportunity to secure long-term bespoke funding from government. So we are involved in a number of these projects. And this is the same map, but just highlighting where those landscape recovery projects are. And you can instantly see how they're kind of overlapping on some of the areas that I've already highlighted for the wild core areas and the species reintroduction. So they all neatly work together. So we are progressing 8 landscape recovery scheme projects. We have 3 in round 1, 5 in round 2, and then although round 3 isn't yet open, we are prepping for that, and we have identified one area at the moment at least, which is the New Forest in our South District, as one we might wish to put forward for landscape recovery. So we have agreed probably the project documentation for one of our phase 1 projects. That's Upper Duddon in the north, and we're expecting to sign this in coming weeks. And that just means they've completed their 2-year development phase, and they're about to embark on the 20-year implementation phase and have secured and accepted funding from DEFRA in order to do that. We do have an agreement offer for Wigan Greenheart, which is our second round 1 project, and we are just further negotiating the documentation for that. So the funding agreement is quite complex, but if that is successful, that project will commence on the 1st of May of this year. And then our round 2 projects are kind of finalising their project plans, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in detail, but they will hopefully be submitted to DEFRA in spring of this year. So it's an exciting time for landscape recovery. We've got some very ambitious, very inspirational projects that are being developed, and they're all starting to move through into the very exciting implementation phase. Just to touch on the round ones again, just to give you a little bit of context around the scale of them. So Upper Duddon on the left, that has 6 partners in total. So we have a university that is leading that project. We have the National Trust, there is ourselves, South Cumbria Rivers Trust, and Natural England. So that is, again, all of these are multi-partner projects. The focus for Upper Duddon is very much about recovering and restoring threatened native species. So round 1 projects had a couple of areas they could focus on: species reintroductions or river restoration. So they are aiming to restore a mosaic of meadows, heathland, wood pasture, scrub, upland woodland, blanket bog and river restoration. So you can instantly see the complexity of these projects and what they are trying to deliver. Wareham in the middle, that has 27 partners in total. That is by far our most complex project that we have out of our round ones. There's ourselves, Natural England, Environment Agency, Dorset Wildlife Trust, and we have 23 farmers and commercial operators. And the focus there is on quite a range of outcomes, and I will go into them in more detail in a couple of slides' time. Wigan, that one, we've got 3 partners in total. So by kind of comparison, it is a much simpler project. That's ourselves, Wigan Council and Lancashire Wildlife Trust. And again, that focus for that project is post-industrial and peri-urban landscape recovery. So it's very much anchored by recovery of 2 flagship species. They're looking at willow tit and a bittern, and that project will deliver enhancement and creation of a mosaic of habitats again that includes wetland, woodlands, grassland, reed bed, and a significant focus on community engagement. So it's not all about just landscape recovery and nature restoration for these projects. It is all about access, connecting people to nature, and telling the story about maybe our industrial heritage, for example, and there's an element of economic revitalisation as part of those projects as well. So hugely, hugely complex. Landscape recovery, there are lots of opportunities. This is the reason it's the sort of top tier scheme that you can get involved with. So there's a lot of opportunities around biodiversity, carbon, flood management, nutrient mitigation benefits, community engagement, everything you can see on that list there. It is an opportunity to secure long-term capital costs and revenue payments for habitat changes. It's quite unique in that sense because it is very bespoke. And that there is an option to use those revenue payments to pay for staff. So there's a real opportunity to build capacity on the ground to carry out the work. So when you think about the number of partners that are involved in some of these projects, bringing all of that together is a challenge on its own. So that partnership working is very much front and centre and at the heart of all these landscape recovery scheme projects. It's all about building the local and national relationships and sharing the learning that comes from that. There are a number of deliverables that need to be developed over the first 2 years. So typically landscape recovery scheme projects start with a 2-year development phase to allow you to develop this set of plans essentially. So they are all quite complex in their own right. There's a land management plan which really articulates the vision, exactly what is going to be delivered over the 20-year period. You also have to come up with a project management and governance plan, blended finance plans, monitoring plans, stakeholder engagement plans, and site access plans. So hugely complex and very ambitious. And we've learned a lot of lessons as a result of just taking this approach. And I will go into some of those in a little more detail. There is a complex business model. You're going to hear the word complex a lot, that sort of sits behind landscape recovery. So whilst it is an application to secure long-term, large-scale public funding, it must have the aim to blend this with private finance. So that is a real focus for landscape recovery scheme projects. And the model is asking you to look at 3 key areas. So who might be the the sellers of the benefits of some of these ecosystem services that are naturally developed as a result. We need to know how the payment rates that we're asking for sit alongside that, how the project might deal with profit sharing, payment sharing, revenue sharing. We need to consider landowner and tenant relationships, and we need to, there's a whole host of things to consider and explore. We also need to look at investor networks. So alongside public funding, are there other investor groups that we can draw down income to provide maybe some of the upfront capital to deliver the project? Is it other grant making bodies? Is it impact investors? Is it commercial organizations that are seeking a return? So there's a whole host of things to explore there. And then we're also need to look at kind of the buyers as well. So who are the organizations that might be willing to pay for some of these benefits, and how does that sit alongside the public funding aspect of the program? And these are just some of the examples of the benefits that they might buy. So a lot of these projects will look at reduced flood risks, there's nutrient mitigation opportunities, there's biodiversity net gain, there's units that can be developed, voluntary biodiversity credits, so on and so forth. And then of course you've got other grants and or philanthropic or charitable donations from corporates or individuals. So there's a lot there, and I'm really not expecting everyone to remember everything. Leanne, I don't know if the slides will be circulated afterwards, but they can certainly be made available. So just to highlight some more of the complexity that will lead into the lessons learned, I'm going to focus on Wear a Mark, which is our most complex, there's that word, round one project, just for the next few slides, just to give you a kind of idea and put it into perspective. So as I say, it's a round one project. It was a £1 million funded development phase. So it was probably one of the round one projects secured more development phase funding than round two, just because of the way the budget was going. As I mentioned, this is our largest partner project. We've got 27 partners included in this, and it was easily the most challenging in terms of developing the proposals, the aspirations for some of these complex landscapes, with often very intense stakeholder interest, varied priorities, significant expectations of land. So all of these things we had to try and bring together to create that single vision. And this is just the project area. I'm just going to zip through the animations. But you can see that the shaded orange area kind of creates an arc, which is where the name came from. Although we had a lot of additional partners join us during the development phase, so that arc has kind of spread out and is a little bit less of an arc. But you can see where it sits in kind of the southwest corner of the country. So it reaches the lower reaches of Poole Harbour catchment. It's adjacent to Purbeck Heaths, NNR, Poole and Bournemouth conurbations. So you've not only just got the project and all the partners that sit within it, but you've also got these neighbouring projects or stakeholder groups which you would want to engage with as part of developing and delivering those aspirations. It is a landscape with huge wetland potential, and that was a focus for the application for Wareham. It was very much about river and wetland restoration, with species reintroductions as kind of a secondary objective for that project. It's got a huge amount of highly protected SSSIs, so designated areas. So again, complex in its own right as a collective. And this was our ambitious vision, and it was ambitious, and we were encouraged to be ambitious. So we absolutely responded to that. We wanted to create a landscape in which natural processes are restored, creating resilient habitats and businesses, nature for all, so working with more diverse audiences, expanding engagement opportunities, and really underpinning effective partnership working between all of the private landowners and land managers that existed in that space. So it was an ambitious vision, one that the partnership wholeheartedly embraced, and we feel that we've been very successful in developing. There were a whole range of outcomes for nature. So the long list there, I won't read them all, but it included river restoration, new wetland mosaic habitats, heathland restoration, removal of invasive plant species, as well as the enhanced access and nature education opportunities that the project delivered. And the aim was also, and this was quite a big aim because it was the focus of the application, was to reduce the level of nutrient runoff entering and causing damage to the nearby Poole Harbour SSSI. So this was absolute focus for the project. So ambitious vision, complex set of environmental objectives, and a diverse partnership to try and deliver this. So as I said, 27 partners in total, farmers, education facilities, RSPB led the application. So they were just leading that for us. They will still be part of the project going into implementation, but they are the one partner that didn't have land in the project. So they had a slightly different relationship with the project. We've got Natural England, ourselves, Dorset Wildlife Trust, Environment Agency, and we even had a garden centre. So it really was the most diverse partnership that you could imagine, which has helped us really understand those challenges, what made it a success, and how we might improve and learn from those lessons going forward. So ambitious vision, hugely complex set of environmental objectives, and then a very diverse partnership to deliver that. So we had to develop a partnership approach to how we governed that project. We had extensive meetings, partnership-wide meetings. We had a steering group, kind of had a core set of members who were involved in the original application, but then carried that through to development stage. We had subgroups, so we split up the partnership to have groups working on the different deliverables, different areas of expertise sat in those groups. We had numerous one-to-one meetings with everybody. That open and honest communication was absolutely a key lesson, I think, that came out of this. And we had a kind of an infrastructure like a SharePoint site that helped us share learnings, share access to documents, and really just kind of share that vision. So it was, again, complex, but that was the approach that we had to take to that 2-year development phase. And it will be an approach that we carry forward to the 20-year implementation phase as well. So a number of successes and challenges that kind of that underpin the lessons we ultimately learned, but were not just unique to this project. These were probably consistent across all our round one projects. So the successes, it was keeping everybody engaged and involved throughout what is quite a long development phase was a real success. Everybody committed to the project. They were passionate about the vision, and that really carried through. And we came across challenges that we had to face as a partnership, but because we kept everyone engaged in that kind of partnership approach, it worked. Land managers were hugely ambitious. That was fantastic because it was a difficult brief to respond to. DEFRA said, be ambitious, but that's quite a hard thing to, because you're going, well, how ambitious? Is there going to be a red line against what we can do? But the partnership for this project totally embraced it. We ran a couple of successful trials for different activities within the development phase. We had a practical conservation and volunteer group. They visited a number of times, and then they've kind of really developed into being a group that can help the project go forward in the future. And it was flexible. It was bespoke. We were encouraged to be ambitious. We could make it fit what we needed, and we very much achieved that. So those were some really lovely highlights and some great successes. They came along with challenges. Private finance, there are a lot of developing nature markets at the moment, so you don't know what you don't know. So many are still in their infancy. Certain perhaps buyers of those ecosystem services were not as developed as they needed to be. So there was a massive challenge around how we forecast the next 20 years in terms of private finance opportunity. It did take time to get land managers thinking differently, but again, that's because they very much have been used to prescription type funding. So you're going to deliver this and we'll give you this. Whereas this was an ask that said, be ambitious, we'll be bespoke, tell us what you need, and we will endeavour to give it to you. So that is quite a challenge to think like that. And monitoring at a landscape scale, absolute challenge, especially when you are baselining for green finance, so private nature markets, and doing baselining across such a wide landscape, a hugely complex landscape, takes more time, money, and a much more coordinated approach than perhaps we imagined at the start. So to do it properly, you need to have the resource and capacity. It just wasn't as simple as going, we'll go out and do some monitoring. There was some uncertainty as we entered the scheme. So because it was a pilot scheme, the round one projects very much were pilot projects, DEFRA was still evolving and developing the guidance that would sit alongside them and support their development. And this uncertainty was a challenge because we would attempt to develop something and the guidance would change. We'd have to not start again, but we'd have to pivot to respond to that. So we were all learning, not just the projects, but DEFRA were learning as well. And then as much as it is a success, the flexibility of the scheme, it's also a challenge for the reasons I mentioned. Telling someone to be ambitious and to be bespoke is almost an alien concept in the cases of public funding. So again, that was a challenge. So all of these successes and challenges really did underpin the lessons that we kind of ultimately learn. And I'm just going to focus on, I think I'm still all right for time. I'm going to focus on just a couple of those in more detail because they were very much the kind of the prominent for those lessons.
You just got 5 minutes remaining, Joy.
Perfect. I can do that. I can do that. So the development phase deliverables I mentioned, the project management and governance plan and the blended finance were absolutely the kind of the most complicated. The land management isn't without its challenges, but project management and governance of a multi-partner large-scale project is an unknown entity to a certain extent. So you were literally starting from, we don't know very much about how to do this, and we only had 2 years, which sounds a long time, but it is not. And the blended finance as well, because of the development of nature markets and how do we bring public and private together. Those were quite unknown, so they really were a challenge. Also, at the heart of the landscape recovery schemes, you had to have a single legal entity. So that was about setting up a special purpose vehicle, if you like, that would draw down the money from DEFRA and distribute it to partners. Now, we didn't know much about single legal entities, how they were going to operate, what is the governance model behind them. So there was a whole host of learning to do there. And this is just one very small part of a bigger scheme. And this just gives you a sense of how it was set up for one of our projects that was perhaps a little bit simpler in terms of the partner makeup. So this was up at Dudden. It only had 6 project partners. Our lead applicants, so Leeds University, were going to take on the role of the SLE, and then we had a fairly simple structure that sat behind it. Where projects were setting up as literally a separate entity as opposed to a lead applicant taking on that role, it became a more complex setup, and that's an example there. So then you'd have the single legal entity, you'd have a board, you'd have various steering groups and partnerships. So it became more complicated in terms of understanding how to manage it. And it's a process that a lot of projects are still exploring. You know, we're still finalizing some of these issues, even for the round 1 projects. So in terms of how all of that creates some key lessons learned, I would kind of summarize them as being these sort of 5 areas. I think ultimately we have learned not to underestimate just how challenging it is to develop proposals and aspirations for complex landscapes. Again, with that kind of often multi sort of differences of stakeholder interest, varied priorities, significant expectations for land, all happening against a backdrop of uncertainty about how the level of funding is going to work, how we're going to match that with private finance, the operations and the governance behind a single legal entity. So the legal complexity of it all is absolutely something that you must not underestimate. Get support, get help, build that sort of budget into your overall budget to help you do that. Timing and governance is absolutely key. Be prepared. Don't start thinking about some of those deliverables at the end of the 2 years. Start thinking up front. So just have that at the front of your mind. We found that projects that had existing relationships, so where there was a partnership already, there was a very solid foundation, and it made that project slightly easier to kind of go through the development stage. Engagement and communication, being open and honest, absolutely key, and being mindful of all the hidden costs that come with some of these budgets where you are tackling a more kind of complex landscape scale project, and don't underestimate anything. So that was really quick. That was a lot of information delivered in quite a quick fashion. But I hope it gave you a flavour for where some of those key lessons came from, and that they are useful. And I will stop there because otherwise I will overrun, because I could talk about landscape recovery forever because it's kind of all I've been doing for the last 2 years. But I will open it. If there's any questions either now or after this meeting, then please do feel free to get in touch.